On this vote, the yeas are 215 and the nays are 208. The concurrent resolution is adopted. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table.
So Donald Trump is upset because Congress did its job. They voted on a War Powers Resolution Act. 4 Republicans joined with the Democrats, and they basically voted to say, Don, you got to stop this war with Iran. Americans, obviously, in large numbers, don't want this war. Iranians don't want this war. No one really wants this war except maybe some people in Israel and some wackos inside Washington and in the Iranian diaspora in like Berlin and London and Los Angeles. No one wants this war. No one sees the point of this war. And a few Republicans, 4, I think it was exactly, including Thomas Massie, the famous guy who forced Donald Trump to open up the Epstein files, they crossed the aisle and voted with the Democrats to essentially say to Donald Trump, you don't have authorization for this war. That is not basically binding at this point anyway. I don't think they would do anything. I don't think the U.S. would do anything. I don't think the Trump administration would act on anything the Congress said about war. They would argue that the War Powers Act itself is unconstitutional. Senate even can't make it binding. He could veto any resolution calling upon him to end the war. But it's still significant. It's still important. And it shows at least some American elected representatives are doing what Americans want. And that is a great moment for a democracy. We seem to have lost that idea that elected representatives are doing what the people who voted for them want them to do rather than what special interests and lobbyists and foreign operatives who've infiltrated the U.S. government want them to do. I'm Borzou Dergahi. I'm a longtime journalist and analyst. I've worked for the Independent of the UK, the Financial Times, the Los Angeles Times, BuzzFeed News. I've also been a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands, and you can subscribe by going to borzou.substack.com. That's BORZOU. Or you can find me on YouTube and on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts. Today, we have a really good show. I'm going to chat a little bit, and then we're going to go to our interview with Sina. Sina is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy in Washington. He is an independent-minded think tank guy. We're going to talk a little bit about the Washington Blob, this amalgam of various think tanks, ex-officials, lobbyists who have this very hawkish pro-war agenda, and they just kind of foist it on one president after another. It's really comical how people keep voting for change and that change never comes about. One reason for that is this entrenched set of interests nicknamed the Blob. Other bits of news today, the Lebanese and the Israelis, the Lebanese government, that does not include really Hezbollah, they agreed to another ceasefire, and this was under pressure from the United States. The United States has been kind of forceful with Israel, according to remarks published in various publications, and according to Donald Trump, even in an interview that he gave to the New York Post, he basically read Netanyahu the Riot Act. He apparently wants peace with Iran, even though he doesn't act like it sometimes, even though he keeps threatening the Iranians. He apparently wants peace so much, at least as long as the 250th anniversary is coming up and the World Cup is coming up. I think all bets are off after that. But he wants peace so much in the near term that he basically told Netanyahu to stop this conflict in Lebanon, or at least tone things down, because that's one of the conditions that the Iranians have set, to agree to any kind of ceasefire with the Americans, to open up the Strait of Hormuz so that the global economy could get back on track. One more tidbit. A fresh report from the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna. They did their latest assessment on Iran's nuclear program, and basically they concluded that there's nothing new. There's nothing that's been changed since the war last June. Nothing has happened to the nuclear program. There's been no fresh news on what happened to Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. There's been no fresh announcements. There's been no information. Inspectors were kicked out of Iran understandably somewhat, after the 12-day war last year, and they have not been able to really go back in, but they have other sources of information, and there are also satellite photos and imagery. And basically what they're saying is that there's nothing that has changed in the Iranian nuclear program. So if the war that just took place, that is ongoing, is aimed at degrading Iran's nuclear program, as the Israelis and the U.S. keep saying, there has been no real degradation since the June war last year. That was when the U.S. dropped bunker buster bombs on Iran's facilities in Fordow, the one that is deep inside a mountain, and struck other Iranian nuclear sites. Apparently during the recent war as well, they struck nuclear sites, but nothing came of it as far as we know. So here it is now, the feature for today. My interview with Sina. He is a Iran analyst and Middle East expert at the Center for International Policy in Washington. He's also a noted scholar who doesn't seem to pull any punches and doesn't seem to have any real ideological biases one way or the other. I've always been impressed by how he calls balls and strikes as he sees it, without any kind of particular agenda, except maybe sanity. Sina, welcome.
Hi, Borzo. Thank you so much for those kind words.
No, I
Really
appreciate your coming on.
Likewise to you. Likewise to you. We gotta try to just push for, sanity and the facts, trying to be objective.
Yeah.
Everyone in this crazy time.
So what do you think of this War Powers resolution? That was a bit of a surprise. You had 4 people crossing the aisle from the Republican side, including the maverick Thomas Massie, joining with the Democrats to basically tell the President of the United States what every American wants to tell him: stop this war.
Yes, I think this is a huge moment. We shouldn't understate this. I mean, the U.S. Constitution gives Congress war powers. This has been a fight in American domestic politics for decades. And despite, the executive branch overreaching, Congress being generally very passive, and they did not have an authorization for the use of military force against Iran. The Trump administration tried to sidestep this and played all these kind of games and, claiming the war's over when they hit this 60-day benchmark. And now we have that 4 Republicans joined the House, and this just shows how unpopular this war is, how much of a mounting political cost there is for Trump. Now, granted, I think its efficacy is more symbolic at this stage, which is still important. I mean, the mounting political cost is a real tangible thing. But in terms of Congress actually being able to stop this, they would have to pass a similar thing in the Senate, and then they would have to, have a
override a veto.
Override a veto. And that seems unlikely, but regardless, this is, Trump's hands are increasingly tied politically, and the midterms are coming up, and this is not popular, including amongst many Republicans.
I was just telling listeners and viewers about this phenomenon of the blob and this institutionalized kind of Washington hawkish consensus: hit him hard, you gotta go harder, you gotta keep going, we can't let the boys down, so to speak. I think it comes back to Vietnam. This was a term that was invented by Ben Rhodes in a famous article for the Atlantic magazine. It kind of stuck. This generalized group of groupthink in Washington, this kind of, tell me about that. Since you're in D.C., I only go for visits every few years or so. What is the blob?
Yeah, well, I would really describe it as the foreign policy establishment, or some people describe it as, the foreign policy priesthood. Basically, the dominant strand of foreign policy decision-making for America and in Washington, D.C., that is part of this paradigm of, it really is an ideology. It's an ideology of U.S. global dominance, hegemony, empire, whatever you want to call it. When it comes to these interventions abroad, military interventions, wars, people fall into this paradigm. They fall into this groupthink. And, there is a whole incentive structure and kind of employment pipeline that you might see. Many people who graduate from graduate school are very much, idealistic and or maybe opposed to many traditional elements of U.S. foreign policy. But the pipeline, the think tank pipeline, going to work for the U.S. government, State Department, whatnot, it pushes people in that direction. That's where the incentive structure is, to conform with the groupthink of the blob. And the groupthink of the blob is, like I said, this idea of U.S. global dominance, hegemony, interference everywhere. And when it's applied to the Middle East, the traditional consensus has been in support of all these regime change wars, reflexive support of Israel, and anyone who stepped out of these bounds was critical of this or called for a change, that this is not in the American national interest, that this kind of thinking has gotten us into a lot of quagmires and all the kind of psychological problems of groupthink and confirmation bias. And, you can see a lot of these assumptions that led to this catastrophe in the Iran war that has happened in the past with the Iraq war. I mean, there's been so many blunders, but people keep falling into this because of this groupthink structure that really needs to be challenged. And it has been challenged, and there is alternatives increasingly now. It's much better than it was, let's say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
But Sina, I got to say, I think that the thing that really challenged the blob this time was nothing intellectual or philosophical. It was just the hard brick wall of not a pure power, but a respectable power in Iran. I warned at the beginning of the war that the U.S. has never really taken on a country of Iran's size and population before, that even since the time of George Washington, even Germany was smaller, and it was also a multilateral effort involving Russia and so on during World War II. And it really hit hard. What was why did it take this? Why did it have to take an actual, I don't want to call it a military defeat, but like a near military defeat or a military stalemate? It seems like the answer to the blob was a military one. Why couldn't it have been an intellectual one?
That's a good point, because intellectually, or at least when it comes to the parameters of the Washington, D.C. debate, the blob had kind of won on this. There was those of us, warning about what a war with Iran would entail, advocating against this escalation, this kind of Iran policy that led to this. But, the other side was far more dominant, far more, again, part of the establishment, much more well-funded, the powers that be. And they won out to the point that before this war, there was increasing consensus in Washington among all these assumptions that proved faulty, that Iran is a paper tiger, it's weak, one more little push and the regime's going to collapse, or it's going to capitulate, and all of these things.
Sina, I got to say, I've talked for years in the people in the State Department, in Pentagon, at other government agencies, and none of those people would say that. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, those people would not.
That's true, but the people who dominated the think tank, the landscape on Iran policy, like the more hawkish pro-Israel groups, the UANI, the FDD, the WINEP, and a lot of these kind of inside the Beltway debates, at least during the Trump administration, it's those people, like, at these think tank events, roundtables, workshops, this idea that, Iran, they lost Assad, their missiles were ineffective, even though this whole narrative emerged.
Which was a lie that their missiles were ineffective, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was so dominant. I've been in events where people, came up with these studies that were very problematic. Like, the studies would be based off of very limited public data, and they would have all these assumptions. Like, Iran wanted to hit 2 sites at the Nevatim Air Base in Israel in 2024, and look, their 50 targeted hits hit all around there. So, their missiles are wildly inaccurate. I'm like, you're assuming only 2 targets at an airbase. This is just one example. But my point is that within the blob, within the hawkish foreign policy establishment, you have this kind of perpetuation and self-perpetuation of this regime is finished, especially since October 7th and all of these things that happened. Yeah. This was gaining traction, despite, many people have been warning for years. The more sensible people, Iran is going to go after Hormuz. This regime is not as fragile as it seems. It could hit back in the region. It said it would hit back in the region. But, they bought their own propaganda, many of these people, in the Trump administration.
Let's talk about what happens when and if this whole process collapses, which I'm still convinced could very well happen. This whole peace process, once Donald Trump is finished with the 250th anniversary, once the World Cup is over, that will be a decent time for him to return to like a full-scale conflict, in my humble opinion. How prepared will Iran be for that? And if you could just talk about that missile program. I know you're not like the most nerdy OSINT focused